Welcome to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine, a show where we report, rebel, and we tell it just like it is. On this show, we center your concerns about rebuilding our nation and advancing the promise of equality. So join me as we tackle the most compelling issues of our times. On our show, History Matters, you know this, so we examine the past and think about the future. In this episode, we're unpacking something that's become increasingly and distressingly mainstream, and that's political violence in the wake of the Trump years in office. This type of political violence we know very well, and we have covered it on this show where we have interviewed election officials who've been in their jobs for decades and who have expressed a level of threat, a level of physical attacks that they had never seen before, absolutely unprecedented. And most of the election officials, those people who help at the polling places, are women. Those, in fact, who help not just only at the polling places, but in the schematics behind that. Most of those folks are women. Over 85, 86% of them are. And whether they are Republican, Democrat, Independent, they have seen threats against their lives. But it's not just them. We've also seen the threats of violence against women who are elected officials, state representatives, state senators, members of Congress. Since 2020, we've seen an unprecedented spike in threats of political violence. This we know from the Brennan Center, that a third of poll workers surveyed said that they felt unsafe, and 79% wanted government-provided security. And the trend has only continued since January 6th and the plot to overthrow the United States government. But that wasn't the only plot. The plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And there's been so much more. These ideas that this was only fringe have now awakened into a reality where we know this is now mainstream. And in the face of these very real and very dangerous threats, credible threats, we want to explore how can we support women who are elected officials, women who are doing the work of preserving our democracy, who work as election officials. And we're concerned about them, not just about those who are running for office and their candidacies, but it's also while they are tenured and in office. Helping us to unpack these issues is an elected official who's experienced threats of violence herself. Representative Leslie Herod has been on our show before, so pleased to have her back. She is a Colorado state representative. She was elected in 2016 after having received more votes, the highest number of votes of any candidate running in a contested election. She is the first LGBTQ African American in the General Assembly in Colorado. And she's had such an incredible record as an elected official. Since 2016, she's helped pass over 150 bills addressing criminal justice reform, mental health, addiction, homelessness amongst youth, business in the arts, and civil rights protections. I couldn't be more pleased than to have Representative Herod back with us. Representative Herod, it is such a pleasure to be back with you again. We love you at Ms. Magazine. We celebrate the amazing work, pioneering work that you've been able to accomplish. So thank you for being with me.
It's an honor to be here.
In this episode, we are looking at how the former president, Donald Trump, has made political violence mainstream. It's really quite shocking to think of a former president as casting the kind of aspersions, of curating the kind of narratives where people find it to be a justification for violence. How has this affected you and where you are?
Yeah. In Colorado, we have been able to pass a lot of progressive policies and elect A lot of amazing leaders. We have a transgender lawmaker and Representative Breonna Tattone. We have one of the largest queer caucuses that we've seen and the largest Black caucus that we've seen in the state. But that hasn't insulated us from the political violence and attacks that have been spurred upon and heightened during the Trump administration. And we see it more now with this conversation around his reelection. Right now, a group of us are facing threats online, in person, law enforcement out in front of our houses because of a lie that was made up on social media that we skipped out or walked out, excuse me, in a big political scene, walked out on a day recognizing fallen officers. We weren't in the building. We weren't in the chamber. We were excused for the resolution, just like many people are excused for resolutions, but they decided to call us the Colorado Six and incite violence against us. This comes from conservative radio that prophetizes Trump's work, if you will, and the MAGA conspiracies. It comes from folks who are waiting for quote unquote direction from and signals from Twitter and from Mastodon and other social media platforms to attack us. And anyone who dares to I believe, be a woman of color, be a queer person, pass progressive policies with lies. Now, it's interesting because these types of lies can easily be debunked, right? There's cameras in the chamber. You can see if there was a walkout. You can see if there was a statement by us, but there wasn't. But that doesn't matter because the lies are so insidious that people would rather believe those lies than find the truth. And as we know, lies spread quicker than the truth. And that's what we're seeing here in Colorado, but also throughout the country.
So tell us a bit more about what was about the lie, the big lie about the big six and a walkout.
And let me just be clear. I believe that as legislators, we should be able to walk out if that's what we choose to do. But my dad's law enforcement. I sit in a very unique position of having a father who's law enforcement, having a very close relationship in the work that I do with local law enforcement here in Denver. Whether we agree or not, we all, I think, agree that we need to get more services to people who need them. And so to create this lie that because we had an excused absence that morning, that we had walked out was problematic, never had been asked. But then it was spread on social media and through conservative talk. And in that, then we got attacks. And I will say that all of the people who were not there that morning were women. A lot of us were progressive. There was one white woman who kind of got rolled into it just because it made sense for the lie. And the attacks are horrid. I mean, they are threatening sexual violence. They are using the N-word. And to my Latina counterparts, go back home, go back to your country. There have been threats and calls to people's children's schools and addresses being talked about on our voicemails and that kind of stuff. And so it spreads quickly and it stays, it sticks, right? And I think that's the most violent and dangerous part. But I think about some of my colleagues in other states, who are just standing up for what they believe. And the interesting thing about this is, to be honest, we didn't do it, so there was no statement, there was no reason for the backlash. And I kind of would rather have that for things that I've done than things that I haven't done. But you think about the attacks that Breonna Tattone gets for being transgender and supporting young transgender youth. You think about the attacks on Zoe Zephyr, representative, and even my good friend out of Nebraska, Senator Hunt, who is not with a political party anymore, but has stood up for trans rights and for people's reproductive rights. And the attacks that they're getting are vile. And I believe that is extremely dangerous because it's hard to encourage people to serve in the face of this political violence. And as someone who's an advocate, right, for people like us to be in political office, it has to come with a caveat now, like be ready. These are not just get a thicker skin. These are real violent threats and attacks against you and your family, and you have to be ready for that.
Well, this threads through the big lie of 2020, right? That Donald Trump won the election, the re-election, which he did not. And we've seen that for women in politics, and notably many election officials as well, that there have been such significant threats in the wake of preserving democracy, the legitimacy of the election. And of course, 2024 isn't far away. We've been covering this at Ms. Magazine. We have a Women Saving Democracy series, and we have been tracking many of these hostile messages, and there have been thousands, some of which you've just mentioned. But here's some of what we've picked up that have been sent to election officials, the majority of whom are women. They are of this ilk for our listeners so that they know. Messages like, "You lied," "You are a traitor," perhaps 75 cuts and 20 bullets will soon arrive. Here's another. "You and your family will be killed very slowly." Listeners, these are what women in politics, women election officials, women who are representing their states and federal government are receiving. Here's another one. "If you send me more emails about this election, I'm going to slit your throat." This is what is becoming mainstream in the wake of all of the types of lies and the curation of fear and violence in the wake of 2020, that election. And overwhelmingly, this is what women are receiving.
Yeah, yeah,
So, I mean, do you see? I mean, it seems almost obvious to ask the question about the role in which gender is playing in this.
Oh, it's clear. And add that layer of we're not believed. We're not believed, and threats against us are not as bad as we think they are. Threats to slit your throat, or threats of raping before they kill you. Oh, don't worry about it. It's not too bad. I'll tell you, I had been receiving threats during the summer of 2020 when I worked on police accountability and did a lot of the protest. I had started to receive threats from this person that were pretty vile, and I sent them on to the officials and wasn't believed, or was told, "Well, you're working on this, so we're not going to do anything to protect you." Fast forward a few months, and I receive a Google alert, and my name had showed up on a court transcript. Knew nothing about it. Apparently, they went out and arrested this person, not for the attacks against me, but because this person started to make attacks against our Jewish governor and our Jewish attorney general. And I say Jewish because they were vile. They were extremely, extremely terrible threats that were being launched upon them simply because they are Jewish. But because they are men, they were believed. And there was literally an investigation and incarceration behind this person who was making these attacks. Now, this person showed up in person with a weapon, which is legal in certain parts of Colorado, and threatened to use it against me. And so, but that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough. And then to say that I'm the one that brought that person's attention to the authorities, but then was not told about the case, was not told about the other violence that he had threatened, and they were worried that he would perpetuate, was extremely problematic to me, because my name was used, which put me in danger if this person should ever get out. But additionally, why wasn't there some type of investigation initially when I was the one being threatened? This happens a lot. I think particularly of our Secretary of State, but I think you can enter any female Secretary of State's name into this equation. She actually came to the General Assembly. She's a Jewish woman, came to the General Assembly to ask for more security. People don't realize that as state legislators, as local lawmakers, as folks who are not governor, we don't have daily security. We are not people who have folks come to our events or walk the community with us. We don't have a security entourage. But she was getting so many terrible threats, again, spurred upon by the big lie, the election denying, big conspiracy theories, big lie. And they refused. They refused to get her extra security. And so we had to go in, and a few of us women said no. she will get the security that she needs, because these threats are very real, and we know that.
What you're sharing with me takes me back into history as well as thinking about what's coming forward. And what you've been mentioning is the invisibility of the violence as it lands on Black women. It's not as if you hadn't articulated what happened to you. It wasn't as if you didn't have evidence of the threats that you were receiving. But it wasn't until your male colleagues received vile threats that then there was some action taken, but not when it was happening to you. And I can't help but think about the invisibility of Black women in violence, even the lynching of Black women, which many people are surprised by, right? They think, oh, well, that was men, and how horrible it was that it was men, but they have no idea of this history of Black women, even Black women while they were pregnant, being lynched in this country. And interestingly enough, I'm thinking about the case of Mary Turner, who was pregnant and lynched in Georgia for publicly criticizing lynching in Georgia, and the things that you really just simply can't make up. So where we are is that there's an election coming forward, and there are a number of ongoing cases against the former president, Donald Trump, which will continue to play out in the backdrop of the 2024 election season, which has really already started. And it's something that the world is paying attention to, that the former president is a leading contender. And yet he continues to mock and bully women through all of this. We even saw this after the recent trial in New York, where he was found guilty of having sexually abused the journalist E. Jean Carroll and having committed defamation because he claimed that she lied, because he claimed that it was a hoax, and as he claimed that she just simply wasn't the type of woman that he would go for anyway. But I'm wondering how you think that these cases against him, because there are also the criminal cases, how any of this is going to affect the national climate with regard to political violence. I mean, do you think that this will curate even more of the kind of emails and credible threats that you've received? And I think it's important for our listeners to understand that these are credible threats. These aren't just kind of and there should be no one-offs. Like, no one should be sending you any kind of vile emails, but these are credible kinds of threats that you and others have received. Representative Keeler, who's been in conversation with us, she's received at least 800 credible threats of violence. But how do you see this election cycle teasing up even more violence given the rhetoric of the former president?
I think that, I would hope that seeing the convictions, the prosecutions, the actual words of people who are stepping up, speaking out, women who are saying that this happened to them, and would help, right? Would make it so this person could never run as president of our United States of America. But that's not the case. My gut tells me that is extremely Pollyannish, right? In a land that I would like to live in, a land that I would like to call this country, but it's not. Instead, I think it will spur more political violence, almost a way to vindicate their leader and savior, Donald Trump, when it comes to these types of attacks, quote unquote, attacks against him. There's a lot of language around she deserved it. She's not pretty enough. She doesn't look right. Wouldn't she be so lucky? And those are all sexual attacks, and it's sexual violence. And I think that this election with Trump in the center of it will only increase that type of violence. And I think that we also aren't fully dealing with the fact that people are armed strongly and heavily in this country right now. People are, still awakening after COVID and coming out of their basements and coming out of their homes and engaging. And so these threats become real very quickly. And again, people feel like they're getting signals. They feel like they're getting messages to attack certain people. And in some ways, they really actually are. There are folks who are sending messages via social media, via whatever types of alerts saying go attack this person, go attack this institution or this group of people because they are the problem. They are the ones keeping your savior
Well,
from
that
being
was
elected.
January 6th, wasn't it? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
January
yeah.
6th, a day of insurrection, a day of a failed coup d'etat, a day in which the security forces for the former Vice President Mike Pence alerted their families that they might not be coming home, right? The seriousness of it was when you have Secret Service expressing their fear about not surviving the day, and yet the former president saying that it was a beautiful day. He's been quoted as saying January 6th, and that the insurrectionists there had love in their hearts. Right? That's the nature of how this has all been cast. I'm wondering that in the face of all of this, what you have seen and what you know that other women are experiencing who are in office and trans elected officials as well, then how exactly should this be captured in a different way perhaps by media? I mean, is there something that can be done that would help to shift this narrative in a way where people can take it more seriously, where it could be covered in a way that responds to the gravity of it?
Well, isn't that interesting? I think, I think about what you just said about the insurrection. And I think it's interesting that Trump's biggest parade and celebration that he had been craving for so long was an insurrection. It was an attack on our democracy, attack on our country. That is their coup d'etat, right? That is their thing, and that is a huge problem. And it's again dangerous for our country. I think is there a way that media can do better about this? Absolutely. I think this is something I've been thinking about a lot, honestly. Um, when these big lies come up, the initial reaction of mainstream media, and I would even say, left of center media, is to ignore it, is to say, we didn't spread that lie. We didn't do that, as opposed to debunking it immediately. They see it too. They are in these circles. They are in these spaces. They are on social media. They are looking for these types of conversations. And instead of shutting it down or reporting or supporting or letting folks know that these are credible, that this is really happening, they choose to step out and say, I'm not going to be involved in that conversation. I think that's just as dangerous, because then you have, again, predominantly women and queer folks out there alone, where they're not believed, where there's no validation for their stories, and where mainstream media is refusing to report on the attacks against us. Now, there was one theory where don't get involved, don't spread the lie, because if you do, you'll put them under more risk. I'm not seeing that play out. What I'm seeing is it spreading through these particular circles of folks who actually want to do harm. And so I believe that the mainstream media needs to come in and tell the real story more frequently and in depth, and have conversations with folks who are receiving these attacks. Now, I am not like our good senator that you just mentioned, who saves all of those messages, who catalogs those attacks. Let me tell you why. I mean, I have young transgender, queer people of color as my aides and my staff. They go through emails, they go through phone records, and I have no desire to put them through this listening of the hateful messages and rhetoric that come through on a regular basis. I tell them delete. And now I've had to recently stop and say forward to this special inbox so that they can be cataloged by State Patrol. But I feel very protective. I don't believe that these folks who are looking at and aspiring for a career in politics should have to hear the things that are lobbed at us every single day in that way, and would love to protect them. Maybe that's not right either, but we have to start doing things differently. And mainstream media has a role here. They have a role to play. If we knew that media would cover this, we would happily forward these messages. We have so many. You only need 2 or 3 to get the impact, like what you just read. But they're not. They're staying out of it until, unfortunately, it's too late, it's too insidious, or they'll report on it once someone is hurt, once an action has been taken.
It's really heartbreaking. And it reminds me of a term that was popularized by Patricia Williams. She's a professor who is at Northeastern University Law School, and she wrote this book, The Alchemy of Race and Rights, a brilliant book when she was at the University of Wisconsin, really integrating in many ways the law school there many years ago. She wrote about spirit murder, this
Yeah,
way in which you can experience discrimination, people paying limited or no attention to it while you suffer in the wake of what people should all be outraged by and put an end to. And it murders the spirit. And it seems to me that that's what you're saying about your staffers, not wanting them to see all of that kind of vile commentary, wanting them to have hope and confidence in being in an elected space, the potential to become an elected official, and that it shouldn't come with that kind of weight, baggage, and threat to their own personhood.
absolutely. And I've recently read that book as well, and some of the subsequent pieces on spirit murder, so I could help my colleagues understand the attacks against us and what they do to us. And
Mm-hmm.
especially some of my first year colleagues who, did not know really, I think didn't even know the impact themselves, um, facing it and the spirit murder that happens. And it's not only happening through these attacks, but it's the kind of ripple effects, that go into communities of color, that even go into queer spaces, our spaces, where folks are like, well, is that really real? Or did you do something? Or, that kind of questioning,
Mm-hmm.
because we've all experienced some level of it. And then it becomes this internalized situation where folks don't believe it, folks don't act on it, and then you don't talk about it anymore because you feel like you're not going to get the response that you need. And so then you become a shadow of yourself.
Wow.
That is something that we have to take care of each other around. And what I will say is, no matter if you agree or disagree on one issue or two issues, we as women, as Black folks, as queer people, as BIPOC folks, have to come together more and say that we are experiencing this together, and we will support each other. For me, it's important that we look at anti-burnout differently, because it's actually, it's really coming back from that spirit murder, or how to deal with that spirit murder, which is very different than kind of your typical everyday, I'm burned out from this work. Our burnout, particularly and specifically as elected officials who are getting these attacks, is not about your typical burnout. It's about our lives. It's about, can we continue to survive in this way? Is it healthy? No. Spoiler alert, it is not, to worry that someone is going to murder you simply for speaking up about your views. The goal is to silence you, right? And a lot of us are very strong-willed, and we're not going to be silenced. But there's still a toll that's taken on us when these threats are happening on such a regular basis. It's almost like you just can't breathe. And so working together to get that breath back, but to do it in a way that we are doing it together, provides that strength that we need to get through this. There was no movement that happened in this country or in this world that happened by one person alone. It was always folks together fighting for an issue, or fighting for change, or fighting for just the right to survive together. And so we can't let them break us apart in a way that we're isolating folks and too scared to receive any blowback if we speak up, step out, and come together against these attacks. Spirit murder is very real, and it is definitely a tool that's being used to silence progressive voices.
With that, we've come to this time in our show where we ask about silver linings, and it's something that we've done since the very beginning. What's the sort of hope that one can see? And I take it seriously, although my heart is also heavy as well, because it says so much about the vulnerability of our democracy, the efforts to dismantle it when domestic politics become domestic violence.
Yeah.
But that said, I'm wondering what you see as a silver lining going forward in the fight that, in the work that you're doing, and then the fight that you have been leading in Colorado for equality for all people, because I know that your work is the work that has lifted up everybody, including the men in the states, the hetero men in your state. There's been so much. Yes.
Yeah. I think there is a silver lining. I believe strongly that there are so many folks who are they don't know what's going on. They kind of stay in their homes and their bubbles. They're definitely not working on politics and political activism in a way that we are. They just don't know what's happening. And when they see it, it's become so insidious that they actually do care. They don't want to associate with folks who act in that way. It does spur them to go a different direction and say, this is not about two parties, or this is not about conservative versus progressive. This is about who we are as people. And are we okay with this violence against folks? And I believe and know that will result and continue to result in that change. And again, the support that we all need to get through and do this work. I know that us speaking out and saying what's happening to us, but also us speaking out on these issues, particularly around the attacks on trans youth, is making a difference. It is keeping trans youth alive. They are coming to us for support. They are seeing us speak out and speak for them. And even in the face of initial loss or not winning or not, passing a bill or a bill passing that is harmful, they know that there are people who are fighting for them. And that's something that they hadn't seen before, maybe. And so that is the silver lining, is that we are fighting together, and our numbers are growing. And so I'm extremely encouraged and inspired by the work being done across the country, knowing that it will yield better outcomes for us all.
Representative Leslie Herod, thank you so very much for joining us again at Ms. Magazine for our On the Issues podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Guests and listeners, that's it for today's episode of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. I want to thank each of you for tuning in for the full story and engaging with us. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode, where we'll be reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. For more information about what we discussed today, head to MsMagazine.com and be sure to subscribe. And if you believe, as we do, that women's voices matter, that equality for all persons cannot be delayed, and that rebuilding America and being unbought and unbossed and reclaiming our time are important, then be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever it is that you receive your podcast. We are ad-free and reader-supported. Help us reach new listeners by bringing this hard-hitting content in which you've come to expect and rely upon by subscribing. Let us know what you think about our show, and please support independent feminist media. Look for us at MsMagazine.com for new content and special episode updates. And if you want to reach us, please do so. Email us at ontheissues@MsMagazine.com. We do read our mail. This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Michelle Goodwin and Kathy Spiller are our executive producers. Our producers for this episode are Roxy Zoll, Oliver Hogg, and also Allison Whelan. Our social media content producer is Sophia Panagrahi. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps, editing by Will Alvarez and Natalie Holland, and music by Chris J. Lee.